Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. He's one of America's most prominent political consultants, pollster, and pundits. He's been called the most influential private citizen in America by Time magazine and a pathological liar by Republican strategist Mary Madeline. He's written 8 books, including a couple of bestsellers, and his most recent book, released today, is Because He Could, a insight into the real Bill Clinton. He's a newspaper columnist, TV commentator, and internet maven. I read and watch him frequently. He's one of the reasons I take blood pressure medicine. He's Dick Morris, and he's here to talk about Kerry, Bush, Iraq, Hillary, Bill, the internet, Fahrenheit 9/11, and Hillary. Dick, welcome.
You know, being influential and being a pathological liar are unfortunately not mutually exclusive.
That's exactly right. I was going to point that out. I think, in fact, they may be necessary if not sufficient conditions.
They're not opposites.
Talk about the real Bill Clinton.
Well, I wrote this book with my wife, Eileen McGann, in large part because we really wanted to explain Bill Clinton to people in a way that he's never been explained before. He is a guy who is motivated entirely by empathy. His motivation doesn't come from within himself. In fact, his thinking process isn't within himself. His thinking resides in the audience he's talking to and all the people that surround him. So that he's a little bit like a headlight reflector on a highway. You shine on him and he shines back at you. But when you pass him, he's dark. And
ooh, interesting.
He grew up in an alcoholic household, so every minute he had to know, is this the moment the world blows up? So in a positive way, he feels your pain. He clearly does. And he absorbs stories from around the world as he campaigns and stores them in his mind as stories. He then ratifies it with data to see if the story is sufficiently broadly applicable, and then it becomes a program. And the good part about that is that he connects effortlessly with people because he really resides in their head. It's not like John Kennedy's charisma is, look at me, aren't I beautiful and intelligent? His charisma is, look at me, don't I understand you?
I feel your pain.
Exactly. But on the other hand, the negative part about that is he also hears opposition overly loudly in his mind because he empathizes with the other side. So that he won't take an action against bin Laden, for example, because he's worried about people yelling and screaming that he's bomb happy and killed civilians, or that it's an assassination attempt. And sometimes he's paralyzed by Republican attacks because he hears those too loudly too. If you entered the mind of Bill Clinton for just a moment, the first thing that would strike you is the volume, the noise, the decibel level of the empathy that comes to him and of the opposition that he picks up and that he fears. And probably the single shrillest, most demanding voice in Bill Clinton's mind is that of his wife. And I believe that most of his scandals are due to his fear of Hillary. You have to ask yourself, why did he not tell the truth during his Paula Jones deposition? It wasn't because he was afraid of the political fallout. He'd been reelected. It wasn't that he didn't want to admit adultery. He admitted Jennifer Flowers in the same deposition. It wasn't that he was unconscious of the risk of perjury. His parsing of sexual relations indicates he was. It's that Hillary terrified him, and he couldn't tell the truth in that interview. Why didn't he settle the Paula Jones case when it started and they asked for no money, no apology, no admission? Because Hillary wouldn't let him settle it. She says so in her book. And why didn't he release the Whitewater documents when that would have stilled the calls for a special prosecutor? Stephanopoulos says, and I agree, it's because they contained her 1979 and 80 tax returns that had the first indication of her commodities trading. So I think the voice that paralyzes and dominates him more than any other is hers.
Okay. You're obsessed with the Clintons. You've written Behind the Oval Office, which is a political analyst, if you will, view, an insider's view of the Clinton White House. And when you talk about the empathy, we'll talk later on your role as a pollster and how you use polling and advertising to communicate a message. But you are particularly brutal towards Hillary. I mean, if you compare this book, the Bill Clinton book, clearly you have an affection for Bill Clinton, a liking for Bill Clinton, and a respect for Bill Clinton, and you have almost none of these for Hillary Clinton. And
that's all true.
Go ahead.
By the way, you say obsessed. Listen, this is not some bio where I'm going through archaeological records. Hillary Clinton is going to be the next president of the United States.
We have to talk about that,
John Kerry's going to lose. Hillary's going to run over Edwards for the nomination in 08. The Republicans will put up some mamby-pamby white governor, and Hillary will be president, and Bill will have his third and fourth term. So why is it obsessive to write about him?
Yeah, I mean, if you can foresee the future in as great detail and with as much certainty as you do,
as Bill
that's
O'Reilly
okay.
says, tell him where I'm wrong. Tell me where I'm wrong.
Well, okay, okay, I'll ask you. Tell me where you are wrong.
Well, I don't think I'm wrong in what I just said. I think that the point is that the Clintons are a gift that keep on giving. And I think it's very important for us to understand him and her. Look, the order of presidential succession in this benighted country of ours is very likely to be Bush, Clinton, and we're talking about 4 different people.
Oh no! Oh no! Can I stick with Hillary a little bit?
Do what you want.
You
First tell the viewers the book is called Rewriting History.
The book is Rewriting History, which is a direct response to her book, Living History.
See, I feel the difference between Living History, Hillary's book, and My Life, Bill's book. Is Living History, I think, is a deliberate effort by a woman who wants to cover up who she really is. Bill's book is one in which he inadvertently and unwittingly tells us who he really is.
Everything.
He's the guy that sat on the psychiatrist's couch for too long and talked too much.
Right. Okay, but I'm reading this book, and you compare, for example, on page 42, Hillary with Nixon. Hillary, quote, Hillary hides a personality driven by paranoia, fear, and hatred for enemies, and a willingness to get even and do what it takes to prevail behind the facade of sincerity and good nature. Yep. And I could go on and on.
Who else do I compare her with? You actually read the book, you tell me.
Well, you compare it to a lot of people, none of them good.
No.
You asked about Robert Kennedy.
Right. I say that she could go the way of Richard Nixon or Robert Kennedy. I say Hillary's career so far resembles the pre-U.S. Senate Robert Kennedy and Richard Nixon. And think about the parallels with her and Bobby Kennedy. They have the same seat in the Senate, literally the same seat, as a carpetbagger from out of state. They protected their president from sexual scandal. Monica Lewinsky, Marilyn Monroe, I admit we're going downhill, but they did. They were both ruthless, wiretapping J. Edgar Hoover and the detective squads going after these poor women who got in Bill's way. And they both were motivated by a I'm better than you idealism, a sort of right and wrong, and I'm on the right side and you're on the wrong side, and obsessed with the idea that those who opposed them were just narcissistic, self-indulgent rich people who didn't want to help the poor, and that was their worldview. Nixon also began his career always on the edge of financial scandal, Whitewater, the slush fund, with a plumber's unit that is indistinguishable from the private detectives that Hillary had running around the place.
I beg to differ, but go ahead.
Indistinguishable, and an enemies list. Whereas Hillary just has an SHI list, he has an enemies list, but that's a semantic difference. The question is, which way will she go? Will she realize, as Bobby Kennedy did after John's death, that means and ends are one of a pattern, that you can't be good in one and bad in the other? Will she clean up her act in the way Bobby did and really become a sincere idealist and spokesman for important causes? Or will she descend deeper into this private hell of paranoia that Richard Nixon dwelt in? And the last sentence of my book is,
which I was going to quote to you. Right. And then the second to the last paragraph of the book says, after you rip her up. I mean, a political hit job, which is intentional here. Let's talk about that a little bit. Our current political landscape badly needs Hillary's perspective, her passionate idealism, her willingness to fight for the underdog, and a compass for issues are rare indeed in our male-dominated, profit-obsessed society. So you hammer her for 264 pages, and then you give her a Valentine on 265.
I have some good things about her. For example, her speech in China and stuff like that. But one of the things that I found most interesting, if I can
Go,
the other
certainly.
one,
Okay, go ahead.
is that my wife and I wrote a chapter in Because He Could that's called She Said, He Said. And what we do is we pull out what she wrote about her role and what he says about the same events. So
They
he's
didn't talk to each other when they wrote the books?
he's dissing her in this book. She says, Bill and I convened the White House strategy session on how to curb media violence directed at children. He says, Alan Tipper Gore's drive to get V-chips installed in TV sets would permit parents to screen out programming. She says, I urged my staff to come up with ideas to improve the family leave law. He says, I proposed expanding family and medical leave, no mention of her efforts. She says, I led the administration's efforts to end the practice of drive-through deliveries, less than 24 hours in the hospital. Bill says, my bill ended the drive-through deliveries, and so on. In all of my life, his whole book, there are exactly 4 mentions of Hillary Rodham Clinton in a policy or a politically advisory role except for health care. And one of the 4 is when she called me to come back in. And in Because He Could, I put together a novel theory of their relationship. I think he can't stand her.
Uh-oh.
I think that in the 1970s and 1980s, when she loved Bill and Bill loved Bill, so they had something in common. Then at the end of the 1980s, he was contemplating divorce. In fact, he spoke to me about using my house in Key West to stay, and he spoke to other governors about the impact of divorce. And she was willing to get a divorce because she felt he wasn't going to run for president in 88. He pulled out. But then in 89 and 90, after Dukakis lost, Bill began to realize he could run in 92. And he knew that the first thing he needed was a buy on these scandals that only his wife could give him. So they became an item again. But then in 95 and 96 and 97, when I was at the White House, they were drifting apart again, and I write about that in Behind the Oval Office. She had less and less power. She had to go through me to get jobs filled for her friends. She couldn't talk to him directly about it. Then Monica broke, and they became an item again because he needed her. But then she began to get mad at him, this woman who had a teenage girl crush on Bill Clinton that she maintained until the Lewinsky scandal broke, I believe began to distance herself. But then she realized she wanted to run for the Senate in 2000. So the same calculus that drove him back to her in 92 drove her back to him in 2000. And now their joint goal is for her to become president. It'll be Bill's 3rd and 4th term. There's no marriage penalty in the 22nd Amendment. And so it's a marriage made in heaven now.
So this lusting after the White House is the principal driving force in your mind behind Hillary Rodham Clinton. In fact, in one of your columns within the last month, you talk about James Carville and Paul Begala joining the campaign, and you question their commitment to Kerry given their support of Clinton, and you suggest that their work will be lukewarm, almost, obligatorily working for him but hoping for his demise.
Let's put it this way. If they worked in his kitchen, I'd hire a taster.
Okay.
But I mean, listen, it stands to reason. I mean, obviously, if John Kerry is elected president, Hillary will never get to be president. She can't run in 08 because Kerry's going to run. By 2012, she'll have to run against Edwards.
Right.
No, not too old, but she'll run against Edwards. And all 5 times a sitting vice president has sought the nomination of his party since 1960 for president. He got it. Richard Nixon got the nomination. Humphrey got it. Ford got it. Bush Sr. got it, and Gore got it. They may have lost the election, but they got the nomination. Edwards will be nominated in 2012. In 2016, if he wins, he's running again, so her next shot is 2020.
I can't think so far ahead.
But obviously, Bill does not want Kerry to win this election. I mean, is there anything that I could say that's more obvious and prima facie than that?
Well, I mean, at least in your mind, that's true. I don't know if the rest of us agree. Okay, let's step back for a moment. I've been reading Dick Morris columns, as I said, for a long time, but I've been particularly focused on it since I knew that we would be graced with your presence. I have a question. I'm a part-time member of the chattering class, and you're a full-time member. How do you deal with errors? How do you deal with statements that in a week are proved to be so dramatically untrue as to be embarrassing? And how do you deal with that? And I'll point out what I think are some of these.
Usually, what I have to do is to buy Bill O'Reilly a dinner.
Okay, so you can
'Cause
get
I
on.
usually bet him. But listen,
Go ahead.
in politics, you make predictions. And, baseball, you're wrong 70% of the time. You have a 300 batting average.
Well, that's what I'm going to
I
ask
do a
you.
little better.
What's your batting average? You do a little bit
better?
better?
No, I think I think I do better.
Okay,
but I've made my share of mistakes.
Okay.
But you point them out to me.
Okay, let me just do a couple that struck me, and then go back and ask what your biggest mistake was and your biggest coup. Okay. 2 September 29, 2004, one in the Post and one appearing in The Hill, where you're a regular columnist. And you talk about, to win Thursday's debate, that's the first debate, decisively, all he has to do, Bush, is state his position on the issues of terrorism, Iraq, Afghanistan, North Korea, Iran, and the myriad threats we face. And then later on you say, the first debate will not be decided on style or politics. It will reach its preordained conclusion, a big Bush win, because of the inherent contradiction in Kerry's position on these issues. And then on October 7th, you refer to the massive damage of the first debate to Mr. Bush. Explain your analysis.
I was laboring under the preconception that the President of the United States was at least reasonably conversant with the English language, and that he could show up and do a vaguely credible job of presenting his position. When he did that in the second debate, in my judgment, he won.
And that's arguable,
in the first,
too. Go
in
ahead.
the first debate, he was just absolutely tongue-tied. He was muscle-bound. When you give a challenge...
So it was style rather than substance that caused him? So you were wrong on both counts.
Both counts.
He lost, and he lost for the reason that you said he couldn't lose.
In my next column, I said, Bush won on substance, Kerry won on style, debate to Kerry. And I think that it was probably the single most pathetic performance by an incumbent president since Ronald Reagan's performance in the '84 debate
in the
against
first
Mondale,
debate against Mondale. Okay.
And for probably the same reason, which is that neither man found it easy to decode his decisions into rhetoric.
Or into easily comprehensible language. And then Bush's attempt to mimic Reagan in debate 2, with Reagan turning to Mondale and say, I won't hold your age and inexperience against you. Bush comes out with that line, it almost wants to make me scowl, which went over like a lead balloon. But let me get to the second column, because this really got my dander up, I guess, as a political scientist. Your lead paragraph in the Hill piece: decades from now, teachers of political science and campaign management will not have to look any further than John Kerry campaign of 2004 to understand all the fundamental mistakes a candidate can make. And you talk about strategy, tactics, issues, etc.
And I'm still right about that.
Okay, but wait, let me ask you, do you have the worst campaign in American history versus the worst governmental performance in American history, and therefore Kerry's not going to lose running the worst campaign because this is, in a sense, a foreign policy and domestic failure as president?
Before I defend John Kerry, I need to defend myself a little bit.
Go ahead.
Kerry made a fundamental mistake by challenging Bush over Iraq and foreign policy.
And you still believe that?
Still believe that. Now, because fundamentally he doesn't have a position on that gives him a place to stand. Even in the worst performance of Bush's, the first debate after it, there was still 15 to 20 point lead for Bush over Kerry on Iraq and over terrorism.
Is that now closing, though?
No, it didn't. It didn't close.
So the internals is still favoring...
Internals stayed the same.
Okay.
But even on Bush's best day, Kerry has a 30-point lead on the environment, a 15-point lead on education, a 12-point lead on the economy.
So it's domestic issues,
an 18-point lead on healthcare. So it's domestic issues, stupid. And that's why I thought, that column refers to the mistake he made in predicating his campaign on Iraq, and he's still making it. Now, Bush played into his hands by being so bad in the first debate that he managed to lose a debate on his home territory. Second debate, I think he came back. But I think that if Kerry continues in the next 3 weeks to focus on Iraq and the war on terror, he's going to lose badly, and my opening paragraph will prove right. If he gets the lesson and he switches from the turf that's stacked against him to the turf that's stacked for him, he's got a chance to win.
But the debate Wednesday night, in fact, as we air on Wednesday for the first time tonight, is on domestic issues, and therefore
Gives him
the
a
timing of
tremendous
the
edge.
debates plays into Kerry's hands in terms of coming out of that debate, in terms of your analysis.
Does a good job, unless Bush succeeds in making the domestic policy debate a large-parted homeland security debate. We'll see if they're able to do that. But I think you're right about that. In a curious way, the third debate is the opposite of the first. In the first debate, Kerry lost on substance and won on style. In the third debate...
And the first debate, he lost on substance?
Right. That Bush was right on foreign policy arguments. He was wrong.
But he didn't make those arguments. He was right, and you're putting
world.
into his mouth and head what you think.
In the third debate, Kerry will be right on substance, but Bush may well have learned how to handle him in the second debate. And that ability to beat him up, the ability to handle him, like in a physical sense, may well stay with Bush going into the third debate.
See, I've had, just in terms of my reaction, I didn't see Bush able to handle Kerry physically in either of the two debates. I thought in the second debate, Kerry kept up his posture of looking presidential and, in fact, looking the president in the eye and talking him down.
We don't have to argue. Most of the polls showed Bush moving out 3 to 4 points after the second debate.
But most people saying that he lost the debate in the polls.
It doesn't make any difference what they say about the debate. It manages
what
what
the numbers
head-to-head is
right.
as a result.
But the head-to-head,
it's like when people tell you advertising doesn't matter, but then they buy the product.
Absolutely, and in fact, one of the central chapters of this book talks about the importance of advertising and early advertising.
I just want to interrupt you for a sec, take on that point. This book, Behind the Oval Office, which was the first one that I wrote after I left Clinton, published in '97. There's a section in it where I go to Clinton in June of 1995, and I say, Mr. President, let's advertise all over the country. He said, the election's not for 18 months. And I said, we got to get on early. And he said, I'll look desperate and like I'm trying anything. And I said, you are and you should.
And you proved right in this case.
And he said, the media will savage us. And I said, let's keep it a secret. And he said, precisely how do you plan to keep that we're advertising in half the country a secret? And I said, we won't be on in New York or Washington.
Right.
And I was right.
Avoid the media
Newspapers
capitals.
didn't cover it until this book came out and told them all what we'd been doing.
Now, let's go to the most recent column, Tuesday, October 12th, this nuisance remark. Forget about the nuisance controversy. A paragraph in here really caught my attention because it reflected very much what Vice President Cheney said in his debate with Edwards. And again, let me read somewhat extensively. You're saying it isn't hard to smash a gang. It is very difficult to topple a foreign government and then restore the country to order. But it is only by going nation by nation and getting rid of those regimes that sponsor and promote terror gangs that we can be successful. The Vice President said virtually the same thing to the first question.
That's why I'm voting for him.
Okay, now, 4 more years, how many more wars?
Yeah, I don't think any more. I think that the way I think it works...
How do you topple regimes?
The way I think it works is that... First of all, I just want to explain the
Go
concept
ahead.
and get to it. Terror gangs, to my judgment, are like HIV viruses in your bloodstream. They don't make you sick. They just swim around happily. But when they find a cell and they latch onto it, they use the DNA of that cell to infect your body. A terror gang, by its own, is like a drug cartel. They can take out a Coast Guard guy, they can shoot some cops, they can do some assassinations and kidnappings, but they can't knock down buildings or blow up cities. But once the terror gang gets a hold of a nation state, like Afghanistan or Iraq or Iran, and uses the accoutrements of nationhood, secure borders, conscript population, tax revenues, export-import trade, diplomatic missions, intelligence operations, foreign currency reserves, air and naval hardware, uses those accoutrements, they become empowered and they become something like AIDS in your body.
So Iran is next in this axis of evil.
So what you need to do is it is futile to just chase the terrorists, which is sort of the Kerry-Gore-Clinton solution. Go after the gangs, lock up the bad guys. In that Times interview, he says, as a law enforcement person, and Holbrooke, his putative Secretary of State, I think, says it's metaphorically a war like the war on drugs. But what Bush and Cheney understand, and I agree with, is that you have got to go and deal with each of these nations. Now, you don't have to conquer all of them. We didn't have to conquer Libya to get Gaddafi to flip. We didn't have to conquer the Sudan to get them, at least in terms of their external terror, to begin to
Well,
flip.
Gaddafi stopped his nuclear program. It doesn't necessarily mean that he hasn't stopped aid to terrorists.
I think he stopped aid to terrorists.
Is there evidence for that?
Well, there's been no evidence that he's done it lately. And I think that the point is a robust American presence, military and geopolitical, in Iraq, next door to Iran, next door to Syria, next door to Saudi Arabia, will, I think, have a very healthy effect on those regimes. Remember that Iran's government is inherently unpopular among its people. The last two elections, the reformers got 75%. This election, they didn't even let the reformers run because they knew the outcome.
Okay, we're running out of time, and I've got so much to say.
Go ahead.
Let's talk, briefly, maybe this is not the brief thing. In your introduction to Off With Their Heads, which was another bestseller, in the introduction you say, peace marches started. This is last year, as if our current troubles were somehow comparable to Vietnam. There's no similarities between what we're doing now and what happened in Vietnam?
Oh, of course there are similarities. But there are important differences. 57,000 dead, for example, 1,000 versus 58.
But what struck me what struck me about Vietnam is that it was based on a false paradigm, and that was the domino theory, that once a nation went communist, the dominoes would fall. It seems the president and you have this benign domino effect. If we topple a regime, that these democratic regimes will follow. I think the parallel is there. I don't know how instructive it is.
I wrote a column saying this was the domino theory in reverse.
Okay.
But
Great minds think alike.
But I don't much care if there are democracies there. There are 90 nations in the world that are totalitarian or authoritarian and do not harbor terrorists. The important point is that they are not terror-sponsoring nations. And Iraq was a terror-sponsoring nation. I scream at the television set when they debate.
I scream at you. Go ahead.
When Kerry says to Bush, we were not attacked on 9/11 by Saddam Hussein. What I say back to Kerry, and Bush should say back, is yeah, and we weren't attacked by Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini on December 7th, 1941 either. But FDR understood that we had to deal with all fascist regimes, the entire axis, the original axis, if we were going to deal with any of them. And what Bush understood on 9/11 was that a country that pays $25,000 to the families of suicide bombers is just as much a nation that sponsors terrorism as the place where bin Laden hangs out.
And we're over. This half hour flew by, and if I could have the last word, but don't forget, Hitler made the mistake of declaring war on us. We didn't declare war on him.
We would have declared war on him.
Okay.
We would have. You know that.
Touche. I loved it. You're coming back.
Okay.
I got another half hour here.
Okay, I'll come back.
Thank you.
I'll come back. Thank you.
Thank you for my blood pressure.